good evening to all of our colleagues in Jordan. It's a pleasure to join you together with the AmCham and your members. As mentioned, ANSI is the coordinator of the U.S. Voluntary Consensus Standard System, and we're very happy to join you today to provide an overview of our activities. And the idea is that this can provide some context to inform possible future areas of collaboration. As you probably already know, ANSI's main area of focus in the US is standards and conformity assessment, and we work together with counterparts in other countries, such as the Jordan Standards and Metrology Organization. So we look forward to hearing from you all your questions and areas of priority. But to begin, we have a presentation that can be shared to more fully explain our role and how the US system includes stakeholders from a variety of different areas. My colleague Sharon Okello will give the presentation. And so Sharon, if you are ready, why don't I turn things over to you?
Thanks, Leslie. And good evening to everybody participating from Jordan. My name is Sharon Okello. I'm a program manager at ANSI in the ANSI's International Development Department. And I support ANSI's US-funded programs that try to build capacity in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. A majority of my time is spent primarily devoted to activities in sub-Saharan Africa, but we do support intermittent requests from counterparts and members to do work on standards and conformity assessment activities in the MENA region, similar to what we're doing today. So for today's presentation, I will be covering the US standard system as well as the conformity assessment system. And then I'll talk briefly about ANSI's mission and their role in the standardization system in general, and then cover some of ANSI's regional and international programs. And then briefly talk about ANSI's capacity building activities that are in Jordan under our Phase 2 Standards Alliance program. Please let me know if you're able to see my screen right now.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see the presentation. Thanks.
Great. So before we get into the presentation, I think it's important to note that, today, more than ever, standards are very essential to our nation's history, especially given the global pandemic that we're facing and, the need for us to rely on uniform health standards to ensure safety and health globally. The standards are very imperative, a very imperative undertaking, and they are also the building blocks for innovation and competitiveness in the U.S. as well as other places in the world. The U.S.'s ability to compete and lead is rapidly changing with the global changes as well as technologies adapt and change. And this is really closely tied to ANSI's leadership and as well as U.S. leadership in the development and effective use of standards and standardization processes. Without this, the U.S. would not be able to have leadership in the latest technologies and advancements that have helped businesses function and improve life in general. So to the US, standards are very essential to moving things along. Essentially, standards are the foundation of a sound US economy for secure and critical infrastructure and for public and health and safety. Standards also provide a common language that keeps domestic and international trade flowing. Again, without standards, it would be almost impossible for somebody in Jordan to purchase an Apple computer or a phone that could easily be connected to a power supply in both countries. So standards make sure that we can trade with each other and also use the same baseline foundation to trade, but also communicate what we need with our technologies. Before we go into the presentation itself, there are key terms that need to be distinguished and kept in mind as we discuss the U.S. standard system. In the U.S., standards are market-driven and product service specifications. Standards are typically developed by the private sector in the U.S., whereas regulations are mandatory technical specifications, which may include particular standards or conformity assessment procedures. Regulations are required by law generally in the U.S. and written standards developed by the private sector may be incorporated by reference into regulations, either in part or entirely, and they must maintain their copyright protection. And then conformity assessment activities or procedures are processes or systems that are used to verify the compliance of a product, person, or process or system to either a standard or a regulation. So this incorporates two of those concepts that I defined earlier. So the US system represents a number of players, all of who serve a key role in ensuring that the system is responsive and caters to the needs of users. Some of the main players in the system are standards developers and conformity assessment bodies. And these are the organizations and sets of bodies that develop the standards and conformity assessment requirements to meet the needs in the market and to ensure reliability of the system. These standards and conformity assessment systems are used by commercial and consumer interest groups, and they provide acceptance for the use of these standards and conformity assessment systems. The government as well is a key player and also provides acceptance and is a very key player in supporting the entire system. So all these groups that I've mentioned work together to create this global community for standardization in the US. So the US standard system has evolved over hundreds of years of changes and adaptation, and it's voluntary in nature and market-driven, much like other parts of the US economy. Standards in the US are created and implemented in response to specific concerns and needs expressed by the government, industry, and consumers. In the US, the system is decentralized and it favors a bottom-up approach to standardization. This means that no central government is responsible for oversight of the entire system. In many other countries, however, the top-down approach is favored in standardization. And this basically means that the government serves as the standard setter or dictates which standard is developed, which is a very different approach when we think about the US system. So the standardization system in the US emphasizes private sector solutions. It relies on private sector compliance verification for both regulatory and non-regulatory functions. So both the private and public sector rely on private sector programs. It also provides a strong voice and greater authority to standards users and individual stakeholders. In the US alone, there are more than 100,000 standards in total. These documents are developed by hundreds and thousands of standards developing organizations and over 500 consortia groups and thousands of committees. And we'll talk a little bit more about standards developing organizations and how they go about developing those standards with ANSI later in the presentation. But generally, there are over 13,000 approved American national standards. And American national standards is it's a unique designation that's provided to a set of standards a voluntary consensus standards that is developed in accordance with ANSI's essential requirements. And this is a document that's specific to ANSI and is subject to ANSI's neutral oversight and approval process. And we'll talk more in detail about that later again in the presentation. So the U.S. standard system, it's basically produces standards that are consistent with the principles of the World Trade Organization's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement and the WTO's Technical Barriers to Trade Committee decision on international standards. The system dictates that standards should meet a societal need and should not be developed as a barrier or to act as a barrier to trade. The system is guided and based upon 12 globally accepted principles for standards development that are laid out in the WTO's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. And these 12 principles are listed below. And, this really guides how a standard is supposed to be developed. There's supposed to be transparency, openness, impartiality, effectiveness, coherence, due process. All these principles need to be kept in mind as we develop those standards to make sure that, all the stakeholders are given due notice and are involved at every stage of the development process. So again, reiterating some of the things that I said, the US standard system, as well as the conformity assessment system, is market-driven. It's flexible and it's sector-based. It's led by industry and supported by the government. ANSI's standard strategy, which is the blue document that you can see on the screen here, it's a statement document of the purpose and ideals resulting from a re-examination of the principles and strategies that guide how the U.S. develops standards and participates in international standard setting processes. And within this document, it provides a vision for the future of how the U.S. standard system supports U.S. competitiveness, innovation, health, safety, and global trade. And within this document, we can summarize that the system is designed to support a broad range of stakeholder engagement. It's designed to address emerging priorities and new technologies, and to allow stakeholders to find solutions that best meet their needs and specific requirements. So a recent study was conducted by the International Trade Administration, and it found that 93% of global exports are affected by standards and technical regulations, and about 30% of that is the total value of America's exports and services. So in line with the U.S. standard strategy, ANSI's accreditation promotes consistency and worldwide application of globally relevant standards and conformance compliance programs. The U.S. recognizes that many international standards bodies coexist to develop standards for global use. And there's no single method of standards development that can satisfy the needs of all sectors. And so the use in the global market space is the best measure for an international standard, and not which standard develops the standard. As you'll see in this table, there's various ways in which a standard can be developed, either through treaty or non-treaty organizations like ISO, IEC, the ITU, or through direct participation in actual standards developing organizations like ASTM International, ASME, which you might be familiar with, and then other consortia groups. So some standards bodies adopt ISO and IEC standards and define them as international, but ANSI and its US stakeholders take a multiple path approach. And this basically means that globally relevant standards may be developed by ISO, IEC, or any other standards developer that adheres to the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade principles that I talked about earlier, those 12 principles. So users decide which standards meet their needs and which standards developing organization they want to work with. ANSI's accreditation of standards developing organizations and U.S. technical advisory groups provides alignment with the internationally recognized principles for standards development that I talked about earlier. So ANSI's U.S. strategy for standards and the actually lays out and ANSI's essential requirements references these 12 guiding principles from the WTO's Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, and it emphasizes the need for openness, transparency, due process, and consensus in the standards developing process. The U.S. Standards and Conformity Assessment Principles document is a document that goes in hand with the U.S. Standards Strategy, and it is it explains the key aspects of compliance verification. These principles in the Conformity Assessment Principles document allow consumers, sellers, regulators, and other interested parties to have confidence in the process of conformity assessment while avoiding the creation of unnecessary barriers to trade. So because standards underlie all conformity assessment activities, the conformity assessment document is intended to be considered in conjunction with the U.S. Standards Strategy. I believe this is the third edition of this document, and the U.S. Standards Strategy, I believe, is in its fifth or sixth edition. So these documents are regularly updated to ensure that they are responding to the latest changes in the economy and everything that's going on within the standard space. So when we think about standards, standards are simply a technical document with lots of language in it and specifications, and they're just a good idea if they're not actually being implemented in conjunction with products, processes, and systems. In order for us to know that they're doing what they're supposed to do, we need products, services, systems, personnel to conform to them. And this is where conformity assessment procedures and testings come into play. The US system for conformity, much like the standard system, has evolved in a decentralized manner. Conformity assessment activities are not centrally organized, and the approaches vary across various sectors. So, you know, much like the standards system, there's no central governing body or agency that coordinates the activities in that space. So the US Standards and Conformity Assessment System are a public-private partnership, or work in hand with the public sector and the private sector. Activities are a mix of government and private sector activities. So from the government, regulatory programs are used, and then from the private sector, market-based programs are used. The system relies on private sector mechanisms to achieve both regulatory and non-regulatory conformance. It's designed to provide confidence in the quality of products, services, and systems by consumers, the public, employees, and other players who function within that ecosystem. So in the US, standards and in the conformity assessment system, no single agency has control over standards. Each agency determines which standards meet its needs. And this is something that has been enacted into law. In 1995, Congress enacted the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, or the NTTAA. And this act instructs all federal agencies to use private sector standards that are appropriate for its purpose and mission, as opposed to using government unique standards. So with this act, government agencies are required to look to the private sector for a solution, as opposed to just coming up with their own standard or going through the development process to develop a unique government standard. This act also governs or has designated NIST to have the legal responsibility for implementing it. And NIST is the National Institute of Standardization and Technology, and it's the Physical Sciences Lab and a non-regulatory agency of the Department of Commerce. They coordinate standards activities for the federal agency, and they have a unique role of supporting and defining and fostering the development processes, the standards development processes in coordination with the federal government. They set legal and metrology standards and accredit laboratories. So while ANSI coordinates the standards policy process amongst the private sector, NIST serves the same function for the public sector. So this table summarizes ANSI's accreditation programs through ANSI's National Accreditation Board, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of ANSI. ANSI accredits testing, as well as calibration labs, inspection bodies, and more. And it provides conformity assessment for the 10 listed programs below here. These programs, certification body, personal certification body, all these are accredited against their own ISO or IEC requirements, which can be found on this side of the table. So I'm going to talk more about ANSI and its mission. So ANSI coordinates standards and conformity assessment system, the system and any activities that are related to the system in the US. We were founded in 1918, and we are not a government agency. A lot of people tend to think that ANSI is a government agency, but we are a private nonprofit organization. We do not develop standards, but we coordinate how standards are developed. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., where our CEO sits, and we have a staff of about a little over 200 employees. Our mission is to enhance both the global competitiveness of U.S. business and the U.S. quality of life by promoting and facilitating voluntary consensus standards and conformity assessment systems and safeguarding their integrity. We represent the U.S. globally, and we have a number of roles domestically and internationally, including representing the U.S. Standard system at ISO and the IEC. We accredit standards developing organizations and accept standards as American national standards, which we will talk about later in the program. We also ensure the integrity of the standards and conformity assessment system. And we do this by promoting and coordinating the development of U.S. policy and positions on private sector standards and conformity assessment system. And we also do this by coordinating the development and revision of the U.S. standard strategy, that blue document that we talked about earlier, as well as the conformity assessment document or principles document that we also covered earlier. We serve as a neutral forum for various stakeholders to have discussions on standards and emerging technology considerations that need to be made by both the public and private sector. And we offer a bridge between the U.S. public and private sectors for this discussion. So ANSI, through its membership, partnerships, and diverse programs and activities, represents the diverse interests of more than 270,000 companies and organizations, and over 30 million professionals worldwide. Our membership includes a cross-section of professionals and representatives, including standards developers, government representatives and agencies, manufacturing, trade associations, academia, you name it. We have all those interest groups represented in our membership. By bringing together all these standards and professionals, business leaders, subject matter experts, and all the cross-section of stakeholders from nearly every industry and society, our membership fosters collaboration, networking, information exchange, and strategic support that enables greater understanding and engagement with and access to standards, valuable opportunities through this access that they're able to gain. So here we'll see that ANSI has a number of engagement vehicles through which our membership is able to participate. We have, our accreditation programs, as well as our coordination activities that includes, workshops and other coordination collaboratives. We also have international connectivity and policy groups that deal with international trade policy and other membership support and management functions that need to happen on an international in international forums. We also have our legal issues that deals more with intellectual property and copyright and patent issues, government outreach and relations that deals more with anything that deals with congressional presentations and monitoring federal policy and other related subjects, and educational and training and so many other aspects in which our members and all the players in the standard system can engage at the various levels. The slide just basically shows ANSI's organizational structure, which is really looks to serve our membership. We have a board of directors that is comprised of representatives from ANSI's membership, and they are responsible for governing the oversight of issues, properties, and affairs of the Institute. And the board they typically meet about twice a year in Washington, D.C. to decide on various issues, including approving ANSI's annual strategic priorities document, approving the annual budget, approving changes to the membership fee structure, and so many other issues. They are also various committees in which we have various members sitting in those committees and overseeing all the pertinent issues within those committees to make sure that ANSI is running in accordance with what our membership desires. And we have many advisory groups through which our company members, our consumer groups, interest groups, and government members and organizations can participate in to define policy, but also make sure that their views are heard within those groups to advance U.S. interests, but also interests that are fitting within their various priorities. So this slide shows the various web information tools that are open to the public and our members to use. within these tools, we can find news and information about the Institute. We can also find the web store where we publish our copies of standards and other subscription items, and various members are able to buy standards off of that, and it's also open to the public. We have our Standards Boost business portal that highlights the value of standards activities in the U.S., and it's a good resource also for learning more about the various activities that are going on in the U.S. In terms of standardization. And then we have our standards portal, which is a standardization resource for global trade. Right now we have information on there on not just the U.S. system, but other partners that we frequently interface with, including China, Brazil, and South Korea. We also have a Standards Learn portal where you can find educational information about the U.S. system, and you can learn on your own, and it has quizzes on there as well to test yourself on the various materials that are included in that educational resource. So next we're going to talk more about ANSI's function as it relates to the domestic standards. As we covered in the previous slides, ANSI coordinates the development of American national standards. So ANSI is recognized by both the public and private sector as the policy and coordination forum for the U.S. Standards and Conformity Assessment System. And within this system, we approve standards as American national standards and safeguard the integrity and value of the ANS designation by requiring openness, balance, due process, consensus, and lack of dominance of all directly and materially affected interests. So currently, there are approximately 240 accredited ANSI accredited standards developers. Not all accredited standards developers are required to submit their standards for approval as ANS. Standards can be approved just as a regular standard for use, but also if an accredited standards developer wanted, they can nominate a couple of their standards to go through an additional layer of compliance verification to make sure that those standards have the ANS designation. And this is just an additional layer of verification that, it's meeting all the due process and consensus-based procedures, which add confidence to the standards that are being designated as ANS. And so just to be clear, an ANSI accredited standards developer is an organization that has voluntarily submitted its standards development procedures to ANSI for review and accreditation. While anyone can participate in the ANS process, only the ANSI accredited standards developers can submit their standards for approval as ANS standards. There are approximately 13,000 American national standards. I know it says 11,000 in here, but as of today, there are a little over 13,000 of them. And all of these ANSI accredited standards developers are subject to ANSI's mutual third-party oversight, including a routine audit of their American national standards, as well as an annual compliance review of their accreditation procedures. So this slide shows the various examples of ANSI accredited standards developing organizations and as well as US tags. Some of the usual companies that you might be familiar with are ASTM International, IEEE, and perhaps Underwriters Laboratory. So we'll talk more in the next slides about the international and regional participation of ANSI. So the US will submit its American national standards for adoption at regional or as regional or international standards. We'll adopt international standards as American national standards where they meet the needs of our user community, and the US will ensure US positions are accepted by international and regional standards organizations. As I noted previously in my previous slides, ANSI represents the US interests at international forum. Some of this international forum include ISO and the IEC, where ANSI is the sole due paying member. We are also a member, the sole due paying member, or a member to the IAF and the ILAC, which deals more with the conformity assessment angle of standards. And we are also the member to the regional forums of the PASC and the Pacific Rim and Americas. So that includes COPAN, PASC, and other forum that deal with conformity assessment and standards. We have liaison with groups in Europe and Africa and the Middle East. In Europe, we specifically liaise a majority of the time with SEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. And then we have bilateral agreements with other national standards bodies, including GISMO and SAC, which is the Standardization Administration of the Republic of China. But we also interface a lot with other Middle East groups, including SASO and GSO. So this slide provides a quick snapshot of everything that I just covered. And at the top, we see that ANSI is the bridge between the US private sector and the US public sector. The US private sector includes companies, trade associations, standards developing organizations, consumers, academia, whereas the public sector covers mostly government agencies that have direct interaction with other regional standards bodies like ETSI and CENELEC in the EU. We also see at the bottom international bodies that we very often interact with, but also have membership to, and then our foreign counterparts or peer organizations like BSI, which is the British Standards Organization, as well as SAC and others, DIN, which is the German standards body. So before I close off my presentation, I wanted to briefly also touch on ANSI's capacity building initiatives in Jordan. While we have not been as active in the Middle East, we have been in other regions, particularly in Africa, where we have a majority of our programs. But we work in collaboration with the government agencies, including the U.S. Trade Representative, as well as the U.S. Agency for International Development on specific issues on good regulatory practice and best practices for developing standards and setting standards. And we've worked with various national standards bodies, including GISMO, with these agencies build capacity in Jordan in the past. Focusing on trade practices, ANSI and the U.S. Agency for International Development, we've built a strong record of collaboration under the Standards Alliance. The Standards Alliance is ANSI's USAID public-private partnership, and it provides training and capacity building support related to decreasing technical barriers to trade, but also improving national quality infrastructure. And this partnership between ANSI and USAID has been in operation since about 2012, and has since, from the first iteration of the program, evolved from one-on-one, one-off ad hoc trainings to project-style activities across various regions, including the Middle East. Our phase 2 of the Standards Alliance program began in 2019. And under that phase, we look to improve and build capacity in quality infrastructure. And by quality infrastructure, I'm referring to the sets of institutions, policies, and human capacity that supports things that improve the quality of products and services that are delivered in a country. This can be anything from standards, testing, conformity assessment activities, metrology, regulations, or any other related activity that is within this ecosystem. In Jordan, under the Standards Alliance Phase 2, ANSI has partnered up with the International Association for Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, or IAPMO. And IAPMO is ANSI's accredited standards developing organization. We have partnered to conduct a 5-year program or project in the water and sanitation sector. This project looks to conduct a comprehensive review of regulations and conformity assessment requirements that will be used to serve and educate and inform national policymakers and external stakeholders in the water and sanitation sector. Through this program, we're expecting to strengthen infrastructure in the sanitation and water sector, and to also, in the long term, provide water security in Jordan. This project is still yet to be kicked off, however, because there have been some delays to this project actually being implemented due to some challenges that are being faced by the USAID mission in Jordan. There's been a bit of a hold due to the refugee and humanitarian crisis there. So we are looking to start this program or kick it off at some point next year. And we are expecting to have more in-depth studies and discussions to kick off this project and get the capacity that's needed within the sanitation and water space to secure a long-term water sustainability within Jordan. Depending on funding and opportunities that arise within our membership, but also requests that come from Jordan, we're hoping to have additional projects that are funded under this ANSI USAID partnership, and we'll look to launch projects in the future to have more dedicated support for Jordan. And this comes the end of my presentation. I hope I was able to give you a good comprehensive look at, how standards are conducted within the US, but also a view of ANSI's role and how we work within the system. I will open up to questions now and also welcome my colleague Leslie to help with answering any questions that come from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, I do have a question. Can I ask?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, Sharon, how often are the standards reviewed and on which basis Do you review any standard?
So standards are reviewed every 5 years. So once they are submitted, they will go through an audit and a review process every 5 years.
Okay. My second question, how do you accredit labs? On which basis or which standard you accredit labs that are accredited to you or affiliated to you, to ANSI?
So the labs are accredited based on the specific requirements that lab program is going for. So it will be based on an ISO IEC requirement document, like I showed in my previous slide. I can go.
Yes, Sharon, I could jump in and help. The ANSI or ANAB lab accreditation is performed in accordance with the ISO Casco standards. So 17025 is the ISO IEC standard for labs.
Okay. Yep. Clear. Clear. Okay. Anybody have any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
We have a question from Ragad. Ragad, go ahead, please.
Hello, Tara, and hello, Sharon. I have a question in regards to, say, like I'm a Jordanian company and I wish to export to the US. What would be the guideline for me to find out what the requirement is for my product? What do you advise Jordanian companies? Where do they start? Like, if you can give us a checklist, where do they start? And when is the process clear and they can ensure that their product is compliant to US standards? Thank you.
Thank you, Rada.
Thanks for that question. I will yield this question to Leslie. Leslie.
Sure, happy to help. So the first step would be to determine the minimum legal requirements for the product, and those are set by the technical regulations issued by U.S. government agencies, as mentioned by Sharon. And the place to start for that is the Code of Federal Regulations. We do have a link to some of these resources on an ANSI website called the Standards Portal. So maybe that's one action. I can find that in just a minute and share it in the chat for a link to direct you to that. But the first step is the minimum legal requirements. And the Code of Federal Regulations for the US has some instructions on how to make sure you're searching that correctly for your product. As noted, though, the U.S. also relies on some voluntary requirements, such as standards that might be either required for just by the general marketplace, that all other products sold meet those same standards, and so in order to compete effectively, you would need that. Or sometimes for particular business relationships, such as with retailers in the U.S., there would be standards associated with that. And while that process is a little less defined, it can vary from product to product. We usually suggest starting with searching the standards databases available through ANSI or there are some others for the US. And then by utilizing trade associations, industry trade associations that cover, from broad to more specific in the US, really take on the function of understanding the more specific requirements for those industry sectors. So typically, ANSI, what we do in our role is, as best we can, provide kind of a connection service to help direct people to the right organizations or resources that might help. As the US system is kind of decentralized, there's not always a one-stop shop or one direct resource for everything. But within each sector, it's usually not quite as overwhelming as the whole system. So there's not going to be 1,000 organizations that are needed for just one product area or just one sector. The overall pool of people involved will be much smaller for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ragad. Anybody else? So, last call. Any questions or anybody? If you allow me, Leslie and Sharon, to thank you for this comprehensive presentation, which we really we should look into it deeper to learn more and more, trying to implement part of it through Jordan standard and methodology according to our also local rules and regulations. On behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce, Jordan, and all the attendees, I'd like to thank our dear friends Sharon and Leslie from ANSI for this great informative session. Looking for more sessions in the future, which will really help Jordanian exporters export their goods to the US according to the rules and regulations that the US government implements. We are proud of what we manufacture in Jordan, and we know our products, our local Jordanian products have really reached so many places in the world, but we'd like to have a bigger market in the US, as we consider our US our major partner. Again, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you, Leslie and Sharon, for an excellent presentation. Looking forward again to meet you very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening and enjoy your day in the US. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.